All right, good morning, everybody. Can you all see my screen okay? Awesome. Cool. So yeah, today we're going to jump into an intro to databases and ORMs. So this is one of our key concepts of Mod 2, and we're going to be spending some time looking at a little bit of code and visualization, but a lot of time talking about these concepts at a high level. They're really important for us to cover before we look at a lot of practical application and code, just to kind of tie in the work that you did over the intermission with what the learning goals really are for Mod 2. So this is one of those big categories. A lot to talk about here. Yesterday, we learned about HTTP and how our web applications relate to the internet at large and kind of where that all fits. And today we'll be zooming in. So if you imagine that diagram that Brian made yesterday, and you focus in on where Rails is in that diagram, now we're kind of looking at how the app in that context relates to and talks to a database, which is separate from our app. And yeah, that's what we'll be starting to look at today. So here are our learning goals. The first is to be able to describe what a database is and how it relates to web applications. The next one is describe what SQL or SQL is. We'll go over some key terminology and vocabulary like table, column, row, primary key, and schema. And we've already talked very briefly about a couple of these things, like in yesterday's project kickoff, etc. We'll be using a tool called Postico to visualize the database. Hopefully y'all have gotten to experiment with it before, but we'll be looking at it more today. And we'll be using some built-in Activerecord methods to create, read, update, and destroy resources in the Rails console. We've talked about CRUD before, but this is a good time to go ahead and write down in your notes or in your document or however you're taking notes, CRUD and what it stands for if you haven't already. It's really central to the functionality that we'll be building in our apps. So again, that's create, read, update, and destroy. Cool. So for this first activity, I'm going to have you all in breakout rooms, and we're going to discuss these two questions. We'll come back together as a group and share ideas, but try to talk with your breakout room about what similarities you notice between CSV files in a database, what differences you see, and just in general, what is a database? How would you describe that? And we'll spend about, I think, 7 or 8 minutes. Let me just get those breakout rooms set up. Okay. Yep, I'm going to open up those breakout rooms now. And we'll come back together and talk about this at 9:10.
Do we have a Logan?
Oh, yeah. Hello, Logan. Cool. Welcome back, everybody. I'd love to hear from some people about, what you talked about. Let's see. Could I hear from room 7? That was Brisa or Kevin, I think. What is a database? How would y'all define a database?
A database in general terms is just a collection of information.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's accurate and succinct. Cool. Anything to add to that?
Not really. We were trying to figure out the distinction between CSV files and a database, how that, like, besides the organizational structure or the format, how it's different. But
great. Yeah. I'd love to hear a little bit about that. What did y'all come up with?
We saw that a SQL is faster to retrieve information than a CSV file.
Okay, faster.
Yeah. And it's better to use a database than it is to use a CSV file, specifically when you're doing this kind of work.
Okay. I'll open it up to anybody if someone wants to chime in. But Brisa, can you speak more as to like why it would be preferable? Like why would we prefer using a database over using a CSV file? Joe,
I guess with like a CSV file, you end up iterating through every single line, where with a database, you can actually use SQL to just retrieve the specific data that you're looking for. So it's a little bit more time efficient.
Right. Cool. So I think, thank you for that, Kevin and Brisa, and I'll get to y'all's hands in just a second. I see you have your hands up, but I'll maybe expand on that in my own words a little bit. But SQL is faster than CSV as far as ease of use and maintenance, I suppose. And I'll say maybe SQL is faster to use than CSV because you can retrieve specific information more easily. I can spell. Specific information more easily without needing to iterate, right? Does that get to what y'all were saying? Great. I saw a couple of hands up, so if you want to put those up again, I'd love to hear more thoughts on this. I think it was Joe R. and
Alexander, I think was the other person. I was just going to say relationships.
Cool. So what about relationships? Tell me more.
Yeah, so in terms of tables, obviously us thinking about the project and like foreign keys, I've never seen that done with CSVs. Obviously the project we had in mod 1, football, basically traversing verticals, there was a lot more legwork up and down between classes to get information from CSVs to where we needed it, as where Activerecord kind of acts on our part with Postgres, like to get a lot of the information, like you were saying, more efficiently, but also relationships between tables. I guess is just, I've never seen that with a CSV file. Sorry, that's all I was going to say.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really good point that databases are more sophisticated. You can connect data using things like foreign keys and really different types of relationships. So it's a great point. Alexander, did you have anything to add or a question or anybody else? Go ahead.
I was going to say basically what Joe just said, the data structures, like kind of the way that they're set up, SQL is set up, it just kind of lends itself to structuring data much better. And also, I believe SQL is indexed, whereas CSV is not, which allows you to kind of jump straight to where you're looking for.
Right. So that's a great point. I'm almost seeing our bullet points becoming a little bit reorganized because now we're getting into talking about how SQL works. So let's think about this a little bit. So we have SQL is better and like faster and easier to use than CSV. We can retrieve this more specific information without easily needing to iterate. Let's actually pull this out into a separate point, I think. So we'll have this. If I can figure out my formatting, this is always the biggest challenge. No, I don't know. Go back. Well, let's just talk down here about SQL a little bit. So I'll open it up for other people to add on to what we were just saying, what Alexander just shared. What is SQL and like where does SQL play into this whole picture of databases and what they are versus CSV? Can anybody speak to that? Ryan?
Yeah, I would say my first guess would be that like SQL is a language and a CSV is like maybe just really simple in the sense that it's just like a text file almost.
Right. Right. So CSV is just a text file. You have, do you know what comma or what, I just gave away the answer. It's comma separated values, right? So we just have this file where we just kind of dump the data in and hope that it's all formatted the way that it needs to be for us to interact with it. Whereas SQL is a language that allows us to actually communicate with the database, right? Yes, Joe.
Yeah, so are tables the only form of like data storage or collection that you can have in a database, or are there other forms besides tables?
That's a good question. What I would say is with relational databases and the types of databases we're going to be working with, everything is a table. That's probably different in other types of databases. I don't know, maybe Brian has something to add there. But as far as relational databases, which is what we'll be using throughout Mod 2, everything's a table of some type.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Let's see. What else can we talk about here? I'm sorry, I don't mean to be scrolling, but I keep moving back and forth. Let's see. So a database is a collection of information. I think we talked about how it's more organized and you can set up things like relationships between tables. Maybe we can move our points about SQL over here. So we use SQL to communicate with the DB and make changes to it. Let's see, who has not gone yet? Could I hear from somebody in room 3? I think that was Andrew, Joe, and Wyatt. What are some of the things that are similar between a database and CSV files or a collection of CSV files?
Okay, I'm happy to talk for my group.
Cool, thanks.
So we were comparing, I think this was Andrew Smith's idea, but comparing the row of headers in the CSV file to the column names that we would have in SQL, so that there was a way to get at the organization of the data either way. So that's a similar point. Right.
Yeah, and I might even like generalize this by saying they have a similarly structured. And for example, the header names of a CSV are analogous to like the column names in our database, right?
Right.
Anything else to add to that? Anything else y'all's group talked about in ways that maybe they're similar?
Let's see. Either the other two want to add anything else in?
Yeah, that was my stab in the dark with the CSV. That's really all I could come up with offhand.
That's cool. That's great. Thank you all. Does anybody else have something to add to this point of like ways that they might be similar? Open to everybody. Sure, Ryan.
Yeah, maybe they're similar in the way that, like, if you're using Ruby and you call rows in a CSV file, that information I think is imported as like a string, but you can also use like Ruby, like a class within a Ruby called CSV that will like parse the information in like different ways. And maybe like with like a SQL table, it's similar. Maybe it relates to like that params object that we used in Task Manager a little bit, where it was like a hash that allowed us to identify individual items on the table.
Yeah, I think you're thinking forward in a really good direction. And what it sounds to me like you're getting at is that when you have a CSV file, every row in that file is you can consider like an entry of data, right? Like we'll look at an example in a little while, but it's the same in your database. When you insert a row into the database, then that's an entry in your table and will become like a record for you to work with later, which we'll talk about in more detail. So I'll just put here columns and rows. Thank you. And Ryan, was that kind of in line with where your head was at?
Yeah, just that being able to access the information in each row. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't want to go into too much detail about, like, I know you brought up the params object and being able to use Ruby to manipulate that data. We'll have plenty of time to kind of explore that later. But yeah, I think that's a great point. And the fact that, we have this data stored in rows, and we can think of our CSV file as like a table, right? If we think back to the headers in the CSV being similar to the column names in the database table, presumably everything in that individual CSV file is going to correspond with those headers, and it's structured the same way. So really, what you've seen me flip back and forth between these slides, but what I wanted to emphasize is, like, we have this concept of a CSV, and a database is sort of like a Pokemon evolution of that, where we can accomplish the same things. They're structured very similarly, maybe have similar abilities, but now we have a bunch of tools available to us at our disposal that's a lot more convenient and powerful and easy to use when we're moving from a CSV to a database. Same concept, but new and exciting tools. Cool. So let's see. I noted, I'm gonna open up a couple things here. Great. And let me go back to this. Okay, so I had a couple of points here as well for, like, what is a database, and we'll talk about these and then probably take a POM. So similar to what we had said earlier, databases are organized collections of data, of information. And if you really think about it, data is what powers web applications. Twitter would be really, really boring if we didn't have the ability to create a tweet or delete a tweet later, destroy a tweet, or to even just read and be able to go get other people's data, other people's tweets and see them. So when a user uses a web application, it's their input that affects the data in the database, and the data in the database that is persistent is what really drives the application and makes it useful. So, and let's see, what did I want to talk about here? I had a couple of notes. Oh, right. So just to emphasize that we're talking about persistent data here, this is kind of a new paradigm of thinking from the emphasis of Mod 1, where maybe you built a game and you ran it in the terminal or something like that. And then whenever you exit the session, everything goes poof. It's like that data, like, as far as your application is concerned, that data never existed. Now moving into Mod 2, we're working with databases. So we have the ability to save these things to a database, which will connect to our application and make that data reusable. So that's what I wanted to cover there. Let's go ahead and take a POM and come back at 9:30. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Just caught up a little bit in chat. I should clarify, or I should let you all know that the extent of my Pokemon knowledge is like the pre-COVID Pokemon Go era, and that's about it. But hope the illustration is helpful nonetheless. Cool. So let's move on. So talking about databases, it's worth mentioning that they need a database management system, or a DBMS. And this is what governs the interactions with the database. So technically, when we talk about using Postgres, PostgreSQL, you may have used SQLite in other tutorials or intermission work, et cetera. Those are actually the DBMS, or the database management system. But they're pretty much synonymous. Just in conversation, we'll probably refer to Postgres as our database. Just worth pointing out, because you may see this term mentioned, and it's just a distinction worth knowing about. And now let's move on and talk a little bit about relational databases. So I mentioned, we talked earlier about how tables are the way that we organize all of our information in relational databases. There are other types, such as NoSQL, there's GraphQL. There are a lot of examples, but we're not going to be covering those in Mod 2. And later on in Mod 3, there's probably like more opportunity to explore some of those concepts. And as you move through Turing and beyond, more freedom to experiment with them. But we're starting out with relational databases, and that's pretty conventional for Rails apps. They have a strategy for organizing data, and this is called the database schema. So we've heard this word before. I mentioned the visual schema in the project kickoff yesterday, because we're asking you all to put one in your README, which is, just basically a diagram saying, these are my tables, these are the columns, this is the data type of those columns. And overall, the term schema relates to just the strategy for how your data is organized. And we'll have something called a schema in our code as well, which will be updated every time that we make changes to the structure of the database. So let's talk about the database schema in more detail. So we have tables, which we've talked about. So tables are that collection of related data, and related meaning they are objects of the same type. They are the same thing. So you have a tasks table, and every entry in that table, or if you think about it like a row in a table or in a CSV, every entry is a task object. They're all going to be the same type of thing. Another example would be if you have a pets table with a name and a breed, every row in that table is going to be a pet. So that's how we kind of group things together with tables. We also refer to these as a resource. So this is one of those where there's a couple of terms for the same thing, and there's a lot of terminology to learn in Mod 2. This is one of them. So if we talk about the task table, we could also say the task resource, and that would mean the same thing. We can think of these as the nouns of our database, the what. So what are we adding? We're adding a task. We're adding a pet. We're changing the name of a shelter. The shelter would be the what, it would be the shelters table. So then tables, much like CSVs, like we talked about earlier, have columns and rows. And the row is the entry in the table. And another term for this is a record. So we could have a pet record. And a record implies or lets us know that this is something that has been saved to the database. It is a row in our table. Columns are the attributes of a resource. So name, breed, all those others, age for pet, and yeah, for tasks, there's another example. We have a title and a description, and those are the column names, and they'll apply to each entry in our table will have those attributes from the columns. Yeah, so just to reiterate, if I have one row in my task table, I have one task record. If I have two pets in my pets table, I have two pet entries or two pet records. So I'll pause here for just like a second in case people are taking notes, and then we'll move on. So I thought it might actually be useful to have some way to illustrate kind of what this all looks like when we're comparing them side by side. Can everybody see this okay? Like, is it big enough to kind of make out? You don't need, okay, cool. This is the visual schema that we talked about for the project. So this, I put these illustrations here because I think it can be a little bit confusing at first, just looking at the visual schema and seeing this looks like a table and these look like rows and the columns are like ID integer. But this is a visual representation of the table structure. The rows represent what will become columns in the DB. So then if we move on and we think about what this pets table might look like as a CSV file, again, we have these comma separated values, which denote the column names or the attribute names of the records that we're adding to our project. And then these values on each row for an entry. Yes, Alexander.
Is there a reason that the rows and columns are flipped, or is that just kind of due to the way that web app works?
So you're talking about the difference between our visual schema tool and then these two examples here. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Can that web app, it just can't do it the other way around? You can't flip it. That's why we do it like that.
Yeah. The way I think of it is that these two like more long examples, the CSV and then this screenshot of our Postico setup, these are the way that you would think about tables in the database existing once the app is up and running and you've created these tables, you're adding some data. This is actually the way that I would think about it working as far as the way the rows and the columns are organized. This visual schema tool, it doesn't have any data in it. We don't have anything to add as far as rows. So this is just conveying like the structure. That's the only reason. So let's see, I had a thought. I lost my train of thought. Andrew S., did you have a question?
Oh yeah, this is a slightly different topic, but I want to clarify this visual schema diagram we have. Is it just a conceptual thing that we have set aside for our own benefits to reference, or is it actually something that we write out somewhere that defines everything else that's going on that exists in the computer and the computer code?
Right. I think if I'm understanding what you're asking correctly, and like feel free to expand, I believe the first one. So the first thing. So this is more of like a conceptual diagram and tool to think about how the data is actually going to be structured in the database. This has just the fact that you went and like created this visual schema doesn't do anything. It's really, I would think of it as a documentation tool. That's why we're asking for it to be in the README. It's just an at a glance bird's eye view. What lives in this database? What are the attributes of these objects? There's nothing here. This is just documentation. So now when I go into my application, let's say I'm working in Rails, or I decide to open up Postico and see what we have, now I see that what was documented over here in the visual schema diagram is translated into what we would actually expect from a database setup. So now we have our ID column, which is primary key. We'll get to that. We have adoptable, and then each record has a value for these attributes. I'll pause here because I know there were a couple questions and I don't know if I answered them well. So does anybody have any follow-up about that? Is this making sense? I hope that this is not like more confusing that I added in these diagrams, but I know that we're working with the visual schema, and I wanted to make that distinction that there's no data in the visual schema. This is just for documentation. And then as we move on and think about working in our application, we're looking at what we're familiar with, a CSV, where we kind of have this concept of a table and rows and columns, and then we can we'll be looking at Postico more closely in this lesson, and this is kind of what we would expect from our database as far as translating it from the documentation to, okay, now I can actually insert data into Postgres, and I have these columns, and then I have 4 records, and they have these values for their attributes. I'll open it up for questions. Yes, go ahead, Andrew. I think, or is your hand still up from before? Sorry, I don't know.
No, I have another question.
Cool.
This is just a side note I just thought of. No, I noticed none of the data types are hashes or lists, arrays. And I was wondering, is that because when you're dealing with databases, you do not want to use those kinds of data types? Or is it just the example that happened to be?
I don't even know if it's technically possible to use a hash or an array as a data type in a database. I don't think it is. And the way that I would think about it is if you really needed to store something like that, you'd probably just turn it into a string. But that's not the pattern that we're looking for. Really, the data types in the database should be integer, Boolean, string, date time, those types of things. And there will be some documentation that we'll share out at some point that can go into like more detail about that. But I think for now, it's probably sufficient to say like the types of data that we asked you to set up your database with in the project description for Relational Rails, that's along the lines of the data types that we want to see. Cool. Anyone else have follow-up questions or anything to add about, yeah, kind of the similarities between CSV and databases, or how this data is structured, or how we reason about the organization of our database before we move on? I'm just reading a few comments in chat while people think about that. Yeah. Go ahead, Andrew.
I'm sorry, I'm stuck on this
Don't even
topic.
apologize. It's okay.
But if I had like one of my pets in a database, and I wanted to have a list of all the children that pet had, and I wanted to be able to reference those children from the pet, but I cannot use a list. How would I do that?
That's a really good question. And I'll give, I guess, kind of a half answer because we probably, for the sake of time, can't get into all the details. But as we think about databases and the fact that these are ways of organizing our data and grouping things that are the same together. So let's say with your example, you have a pet and a pet has children. So maybe like our cat, Barry Manilow, had a litter, right? So we could have maybe a kittens table where the kittens have what's called a relationship. Or maybe that could be another one-to-many relationship. And then we will use Activerecord, our ORM, in combination with how our database is set up with foreign keys and primary keys to reason about that relationship. And then we'll be able to use SQL and Activerecord to say, hey, I want you to return to me all of Barry Manilow's kittens. That would be like a one-to-many relationship, right? So that's how I would envision something like that. Really, I would think about it less as adding a whole list as part of an entry in this pets table, and more as thinking about the children as separate entities that can be connected with primary and foreign keys. Does that answer your question?
Well, it does, but then I have more questions.
Of course, yeah.
What happens if you have a relationship where you can have multiple things? So like in this example, there's only two parents, and that's the limit. But if you had something more complex, like people groups inside of countries, where a country has multiple people groups, but we don't know how many it'll have, and people groups can live in multiple different countries spread out, but we don't know how many countries there are. So I just have more questions. You probably can't get into those right now, though.
No, it's okay. But yeah, that's exactly right. And now what you're starting to explore, like what we're starting to reason about is called a many-to-many relationship. And we're going to save that for later. Right now, we are just going to focus on the one-to-many relationships. And they can, like, all of this stuff can get really complicated. So I'll put a pin in that for right now, but there will be a lot of chances to talk more about how relationships are organized and how that plays into Rails and how we organize all the code that goes along with that. So great questions, but I'm going to keep moving on unless anybody else has questions about this slide. Cool. Okay. I could focus on the thing. Cool. So that's kind of a good segue, I think, into primary keys. So typically, really, you can almost say always, every table is going to have an ID column. This could be probably overwritten somehow. I don't know how or why you would. In Rails especially, like the ID column is the unique identifier for each row. And this is called the primary key. So when we're looking up a record, like let's say, I'm trying to think of an example from Task Manager. So let's say I'm looking up a task. We're going to look up that task by its ID, and the ID is the primary key. It's more efficient that way. You don't necessarily want to look it up by name or description, because you could see how maybe another task could have the same name or the same description, but the IDs will always be unique and they'll always be indexed, which is something in SQL that we won't go into right now, but just suffice to say that the primary key is the way that we want to look up our records. And it is the unique identifier for them. And there are also foreign keys that are worth learning about. We won't cover them in this lesson. That one-to-many lesson that's on y'all's calendar for this afternoon, I believe, should go into more detail about foreign keys, but primary keys are kind of where we're going to have our focus today. Let's see. Let's go ahead and move on and talk a little bit about SQL, SQL. I don't know. I think some people have opinions about whether it should be pronounced SQL or SQL. I think either is fine. Just depends. This stands for Structured Query Language. And it's used to, as it would imply, query relational databases. So SQL is what we use, as we mentioned before, to go talk to our database and get information from it, or to say, hey, database, do something to whatever you specify in the query. So this is what we use for CRUD actions. So we'll get into the specific syntax for this later, but we will need to use SQL in some capacity to create records, to read records, to update, and to destroy them. If you think about a CSV, one of the differences, we may have touched on it, I don't remember for sure, but one of the differences, you can just go into a CSV file and type and edit, right? In whatever text editor will work for you. But with a database, we talked about how SQL is our language that we write in. SQL is how we communicate with the database, or with our databases. So we'll have various queries for all of these CRUD actions that we did in Task Manager and are working on in the project now. Another reason we might need to query a database is for data analysis. For example, maybe we have like an online shop and we want to know which merchants have generated the most revenue so that we can feature them on the homepage, something like that. That would be something that would be information we would gain from the database by using SQL. You could also say which shelters have the fewest pets, so that you can send more pets their way or something like that. So data analysis is another big category of how and why we would use SQL. And also, like I mentioned earlier, I think, altering the database schema. So when we want to change the structure of the database, like let's say add a column or remove a column, we would need to use SQL to give those instructions to the database as well. It's a little bit different than creating, updating, reading, or destroying a resource. You're actually changing kind of the bones, so to speak, of your database, but SQL is how you do that as well. So there's that. Let me think here. Yeah, we're gonna go back out into breakout rooms in a little bit and do a post-to-co activity. So I want to pause and see if anybody has questions or things to talk about with SQL before we kind of move into that section. Ryan.
Yeah, the data analysis, some of these words I'm trying to like figure out which ones mean what. So like for SQL is going to analyze the data and find out like which shelters have the fewest pets. It says for the project we're doing, it says on the rubric that no Ruby is used to process data. Is that kind of related to this data analysis, meaning that like SQL is going to process the data and Rails or Ruby is going to display it dynamically, kind of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, mostly. I'll elaborate a little bit. So when we say we're looking for projects that don't use any Ruby to process data, I think this will be clearer after the rest of today's lesson, because what we're looking for is for Activerecord versus just plain Ruby. And we're going to be talking about Activerecord more in the later part of this lesson. But Activerecord is, you know, as a sneak preview, Activerecord is kind of sits between the database and SQL and all that and our Ruby code. So Activerecord is like a translator. So yes, the heavy like data crunching, looking at all the, looking at all the pets and trying to find one with, or only returning ones that are over the age of 5 for instance, that would be for big picture, like kind of pulling back on what we're looking for in the project, that would ideally be done with an Activerecord query. You're going to call an Activerecord method, and then Activerecord knows how to go do that in SQL. Database SQL does stuff, returns to you all the pets over the age of 5, sends it back to Activerecord. Activerecord says, okay, this is great. I know how to turn this into Ruby. And it puts it, and then we get these Ruby objects back that are easier to work with. And we'll be talking about that in more detail, so I don't want to go too far there. But yeah, that's what the rubric is getting at. That really, when we're trying to figure out that stuff, what we wouldn't want to do is set up like a local Ruby variable and then iterate through all of the pet objects and like keep if age is over 5 and like set that up in a Ruby array. We wouldn't want to process that in Ruby because it's not as efficient, and the learning goals for Mod 2 are like really focused on Activerecord and becoming comfortable with that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. It does.
Cool. What other questions? Oh, Claudia, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is more kind of pertaining to the project. So on Rails apps, when you design your database and then you want to, you know, do some data analysis with SQL, does it automatically go to SQLite 3? Because that's kind of what mine went to rather than standard SQL.
Yeah, so it sounds like the database management system that you have set up is SQLite 3 and not Postgres. And there are certain commands to run when you start up the project to specify which database to use. There are ways to configure it after the fact too, I'm pretty sure. That shouldn't be too difficult. But yeah, I think what you're running into there is that you're using SQLite 3 instead of Postgres. Now, different DB management systems like Postgres, SQLite, various others, they all use SQL to like, they all use the SQL language, but the management system might have slight different like syntax differences and stuff like that. So we do want people to be using Postgres for this project. And sorry, I may have missed part of your question. Did that answer what you needed to know, or was there more to your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, sure. Cool, thanks. Anyone else before we take a palm? Any other questions coming up? Yes, Andrew?
So I have no idea how Postgres works or how we're supposed to use it. Is that something we're going to be going over later?
You have no idea how Postgres, sorry, can you repeat that?
I have no idea how it works or how we're supposed to use it. Will we discuss that later, or is that something we need to start learning on our own very quickly?
Gotcha. I think that this next activity, working with Postico, will hopefully be helpful. As far as like how it works or how to use it, there's a certain level of like stuff that we can be comfortable knowing that it just knows how to do the magic. I would focus most on, just understanding how the SQL and Activerecord play together in the app. And then, usually like actually configuring your specific management system like Postgres or whatever is more straightforward. But we will get a chance to work with Postico and SQL in just a second, actually. I'm going to say let's take another POM and come back at 10, and then we'll get into that in more detail. Cool. Welcome back, everybody. Let's pick it back up. So the next thing we're going to be doing is this post-to-co activity from the lesson plan that's linked in the calendar. I'll send you out into breakout rooms again, but first let's, if y'all would follow along so that we can make sure everybody's set up with post-to-co, that would be great. So what I'm going to do that, if folks could follow along, if you get stuck at any point or if it's not working for you, then you can hang back from breakout rooms and we'll troubleshoot together. But basically, I should be able to just spotlight search for post-to-co and open that up. Yours potentially could look something like this, but you should be able to just say connect in any case and get to here. So actually, I'll do that again because I realize I went kind of fast. So opening up post-to-co and then just hitting connect. Can you give me a hand raise if you got that far and got to something like this? Okay, cool. Few people. Cool. All right. Is anybody running into, let's see, trying to think of what specific errors, or let's see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I think that's probably okay. I think the next thing would be, and I'll go into troubleshooting as well, but the next thing would be clicking on this little elephant that says localhost. And this should show you all of your different databases that you have set up. I probably have more than you. Can you keep your hand up if you got this far? Cool. Okay, I'll go ahead and open up the breakout rooms. And if you are like having any technical difficulties, feel free to just hang back and we'll look at those first. So give me a second here. And before I do that, this is the post-to-co activity. Everybody should be doing this on their own. So everybody is driving their own exercise, but you can discuss these questions as a group and potentially look at each other's work if anything comes up that's worth discussing. And if you have a lot of extra time, you can go ahead and try the extensions. So I'll be here if y'all have questions, but again, we're just doing the activity that's linked in the calendar here. So let me open up those breakout rooms. And if anybody has technical difficulties, we'll work through those. Cool.
Looks like everybody left.
Everybody did leave, except Kevin.
I think he's in transition.
Looks like it. I think I made you a co-host, so we should both be able to float around and see how people are doing. So I think I'm going to do that just in case some people did have difficulties.
Cool. Should I start from the bottom?
Sure, I'll start at room 1.
Perfect.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
True. That's a good point.
So Texan that you couldn't possibly be Texan.
But it's not like, hey y'all. It sounds like a accent, you know. It's from going to Texas Roadhouse too much, I think.
Hey y'all, I just wanted to, there I go. Hey y'all. Yeah, I just.
We just decided howdy do is the new hey y'all.
Howdy.
Yeah. Howdy do.
Howdy do. Wanted to double check and make sure everybody got set up with Postgres. Were you all able to get to like your database and get started with the activity, or can we troubleshoot anything?
I think I'm good so far.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm also good. I just gotta I have so many things open on my computer. I'm closing things out first, yeah. But we're working. We're getting there.
No, it's all good. No rush. I wanted to make sure you were set up to get started. But yeah, holler if you need anything. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Hi, I was just checking in to make sure everybody got set up with Postico okay. Is everything going smoothly?
So far.
Awesome. Cool, cool, cool. Thanks, y'all.
Oh, I see filter. I see. Is that what they mean? Like,
Oh,
I'm not sure.
yeah, I don't know because my thing says filtering rows is not supported in the free trial. So
really?
Yeah.
Let me see.
Also in the lower left, there's it's like currently selected on content, and then if you go over to structure, this is possibly where we could do something.
I got the same error, Wyatt, or the paywall thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whoops.
Could we take a look at that? Would one of y'all share?
Yeah, I could share. Oops. So when I go, okay. When I go like apply filter, then
Gotcha.
yeah.
Okay, so let's, which piece of the activity are y'all working on right now?
The execute the following SQL queries.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, so if you go to, can you go back to like your task manager development? Yeah, if you click on that in the very top, yeah. So now if you go to SQL query, if you double click on that, this gives you a console where you can experiment running SQL queries.
Okay, cool.
Cool.
And we want to be doing generally, I mean, I actually don't even know if you could do this from the command line, right? But
Yeah.
we want to be doing this in Postico.
Yeah, so you can do it with the command line with a command called PSQL. Postico is a lot more like visual and I think easy to understand. And really in like a production database, like out on the job, you probably wouldn't want to be going in and messing with tables in Postico. But this is more to just get the idea across of what the DB is doing. So, but yes, you could do this in the command line as well. You could type PSQL into your command line and run commands from there. And you can feel free to explore that if you want.
Yeah, I'm never sure when to do that with the built-in stuff. Like in mod 1, we were cautioned against using terminal in VS Code. I don't remember why, but yeah.
Yeah, I'd say if you have extra time after working through all the Postico questions, you can try out PSQL. I mean, this is all just kind of sandbox data, so it's very unlikely that you'll damage anything beyond repair. So yeah, if you want to check it out, I think that's fine. Another breakout room called for help. So holler if you need anything, but hope that helps. See y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, sorry for the delay. What's up?
No problem. I'm just having trouble because I can't get it to look like what you were having it look like earlier, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to click.
Okay, let's click connect. Gotcha. Let's see.
I mean, does that mean I need to have a different host name? Should the host name match the computer name thing I have, or?
I would say, I wonder what would happen if you removed host Andrew and removed the database and just used like your user and password. I don't even think that I have to enter a password, but maybe you could try connecting now.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Is this what it's supposed to look like?
Yep, and then you can click on a philosopher up there on the very top to get back to all of your databases, and then you can click on a database to experiment with it. Not sure where your task manager DB is, but you could also feel free to create one.
Okay, so how would I get task manager into here if I've never been able to put it in here before? Like there has to be a way to tell it to go to this place and put it in.
Well, I'm surprised that it doesn't just show up, because I would think that when you created Task Manager, you did it under the A Philosopher like username. But if you go back to where you were just a second ago, if you just hit the back button, it looks like you can just click New Database here in Postico. So that might be how I would move forward for the lesson. It's on the bottom left corner. And you can do Task Manager and then experiment with adding tables to that.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I'll try to follow this out.
Cool, thanks. I have gotten a call from another breakout room, but if you have follow-up questions, feel free to hop back into the main room or give me a shout.
Okay.
Thanks. Hello. How can I help?
Hello.
Hi, Jameson. I was just hoping for some clarity on the execute the following SQL queries, retrieve all tasks, and so on and so forth. Is that done through Postico?
Yeah, it's a good question. Do you mind sharing your screen? It can be done in the command line, but there's a pretty easy way to do it in Postico, and we can walk through that.
Share screen.
Cool. So if you go to, if you click on the localhost elephant, and then you click on your database, whichever one, maybe that's where you were. I'm sorry, I didn't pay attention.
Okay.
But then you can click on SQL query from any of those databases and run queries from here.
Oh wow, there's a whole tab right there that says SQL query.
It is not the most intuitive software, but yeah, you should be able to run these here. If you wanted to experiment with the command line, that command is PSQL. It'll put you in a Postgres session. It's not nearly as visually easy to follow as this, but that's also an option.
Okay, so I didn't really understand what you just said right there at that last.
Sorry, that's okay. This is the way I would recommend doing these exercises in the activity.
Using this.
Yes, using the Postico GUI, and then you can just execute statement, or I think you can just hit enter. There are ways to do this in the command line, but I wouldn't necessarily worry about that right now.
Right. Okay. And then the command line stuff was called what again? That you had.
That if you wanted to enter a session to run SQL queries from the command line, you would type in PSQL.
Right. Right. Okay. Got it. Thank you. Did y'all have any questions before Jameson heads out?
That was all. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
No problem.
Thank you.
What I wanted to make sure was that this didn't say add this to your ZSH profile. So that could have been your built-in VS Code terminal, and your terminal app could have been using different shells, which would be ZSH or Bash. That would not be good, but that looks good that we're on this Bash profile. So I think we just follow these instructions here. It says load rbenf automatically by appending the following to your Bash profile. So just copy that line right there and paste that into that Bash profile. Sorry, into the file in your VS Code.
So just anywhere in here?
Yep. And then let's go ahead and restart everything. So let's save that file. Let's close out of VS Code. Yeah, we don't need that.
Insert, and then isn't it in parentheses? You would do I'm pretty sure it should do the ID for you, but title, colon, I don't know, groceries or whatever, laundry, whatever you want. Or actually, it's got to be string, right? Title string.
You would have to redo this, but in a different file. I think it's called .zshrc. But anyway, now let's go ahead and do ruby-v. Oh yeah, and you'll probably need to. Oh, well, there we go.
Go back to our
Oh yeah.
Wait,
So you should be
never mind.
okay. Yeah, you shouldn't have to run that. I think you can just run bundle from the command line. I think we're ready to run that. So yeah, go and run bundle. The way that this works is that this bundler will install gems per Ruby version. So now that we've switched Ruby versions, we would need to rebundle. Yeah, so let's try our Rails DB create now. Can't find gem for rail ties. Oh yeah, okay. So I think we need to install Rails now. Can you do Rails-V from the command line? Yeah, I can't even find that. Can you cd out of this directory? Can you go up one? And let's do Rails-V here. Still not working.
I'm gonna do it from.
Let's do gem list Rails. Yeah, we don't have any Rails here. Okay, so let's go back to the intermission work page and find that copy, find that command for installing Rails. So this is the same thing here. When you have a new Ruby version, you need to install gems for that Ruby version, including Rails.
So because I swapped from 2.5, 2.6.3, it I got you. Okay.
Yes.
So I did all this already.
Yeah. Oh, well, let's get out of this. So don't put your password in. You want to avoid doing the sudo version.
Okay. Well,
yeah.
The strange, not Steam. The strange thing is, it would tell me that I don't have the permissions.
Right.
If I didn't do sudo, but I can.
That's. I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt. That is a problem. So I think the reason why it was telling you that was because you hadn't properly used RBENV or you hadn't set that up. So rather than installing into your, can you do, let's do which RBENV? Do which Ruby, sorry, wrong thing. So this shows you where this Ruby command can be found, and we can see that this is going through your .rbenv directory. What it was doing before was it was using the built-in version of Ruby, which is not stored in this rbenv directory. So that's why you had to use sudo, is because it was like a different directory that you didn't have permissions for. So hopefully we should be able to run the command without sudo now, because we should have write access to this rbenv directory. Yeah, that's what we want to see.
Yeah, again, sorry for having to go through it, but I've even, I mean, I know yesterday was day one, but I'm like, bro, like I can't follow because I can't do anything.
Yeah, you don't need to apologize. These environment issues are definitely frustrating to work through, and I mean, it happens to me all the time where I just like get past what I know how to do and I just need someone else's eyes on it. This is not something I would expect you to be able to debug on your own.
Hello. Just wanted to check in and see how things are going for y'all, and just about how far you'd gotten.
Jahara's been trying to help me a little bit, but I am completely lost still. I don't think I've moved hardly at all. Here, how about I share my screen so you can see what I'm trying to do?
Okay.
Jahara, could you? Yeah, thanks. So this is what I have. Unlike Jahara's, I have create column instead of create row, which is kind of confusing me.
Yeah, I may have, this worked differently than I expected. So I think there might be a better way to get you set up with a DB for this. Can you go ahead and just click discard changes on the bottom left?
Discard changes, yeah.
And then if you go, let's see, how can we do this? Can you open up your terminal and navigate to your task manager directory?
Yeah. Let's see.
Take your time. While you're doing that, Jahara, how's the exercise going for you? Any questions in the meantime?
No, I got through it and was able to bring back the tasks, and obviously none of them are laundry. So no.
Awesome. Cool, thanks. All right, so yeah, I think it's interesting that Postico did not do what I expected, but when we get to your task manager directory, looks like.
So I think I called it pre-work mode 2 rather than task manager. I'm not sure.
Well, can you do an LS so we can make sure we're in the right place? Cool. Yeah, this looks right to me. What happens if you run Rails space DB? No, yeah, no, just a space. DB : create. Yeah, just like that. Okay, it says it already exists. Oh, so do y'all have an idea of what's going on here just by reading that output?
SQLite 3 already exists. Well, I don't even know what the Rails database create necessarily is supposed to be unless it's saying to create a database, which I think I've already done in this area. So
exactly. But why is this not showing up in Postico?
I don't even know what Postico is.
Because it's in SQLite 3.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, exactly, Jahara. So Postico is just this tool that we're using, and it's okay that you aren't familiar with it because this is the first time, that we're really digging into it in detail. But Postico gets its name from working with PostgreSQL. And we can't have a Postgres, like your Postgres database doesn't exist in Postico because your task manager database is SQLite.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think the path forward to fix this, and we might not have time in the breakout rooms, but you could find maybe if there's anything else you have that does have a Postgres database, but if not, that's okay. Really, you would need to go into your task manager project and change the configuration to work with Postgres instead of SQLite. Then you can do these commands like Rails DB drop, Rails DB create, and then your database should appear here in Postico. I wouldn't worry about it too much for right now. I would maybe focus on like any of the discussion questions. We'll be coming back to the main room in a little bit. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Sorry, I led you astray with creating in Postico. I was making some assumptions, but yeah, hope that was helpful.
Yeah, I feel like I learned a little bit at least.
Yeah, okay, great. That's all we can hope for. That's all we can aim for. I'll see y'all in a couple minutes back in the main room.
I do have a question.
Oh yeah, what is it?
So would SQLite 3 have been the default? Like if someone just was not intentionally looking to create the database in Postico, like would that have happened commonly? Is that something that we need to be aware of, or is that just kind of a fluke?
Yeah, so SQLite 3 is going to be the default database for Rails projects. So the key to just avoiding that issue up front would be there's a special flag to include in your Rails new command. When you run Rails new task manager, skip turbolinks, whatever, there's a flag that's like something like -- database equals PostgreSQL. And it like I mentioned, you can go back into like your configuration in your Rails project and change it later, but the default is always going to be SQLite 3. So from here on out, when we're creating new Rails projects, just try to remember to include that flag to make it simpler. That's what I would recommend. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Cool. Okay, thanks y'all. See you in a minute.
Do you want the Stack Overflow answer?
Yeah, let's read that one. Oh, this is old. That's okay. What does it say? So previous Ruby EMB installed on your system prior to your installation, which is good. Shem path.
Value. Yeah. Hi, Jameson.
Hello, hello. How are y'all?
Pretty good. We were playing around a while ago and I created a data point, but I didn't finish it. And it popped up as null. So we're trying to recreate how we got that null.
Interesting. Okay.
Because then we also created like false sample data with nothing in it through the local. And we also did it via this. So we were just trying to see how we got that null one more time.
Well, it's weird. When we doing our oil car task, we got an error, but we corrected. We
also got a error when I did, but I can't recreate it anymore. So I'm not sure if it was.
It was something having to do with the description. Did you do like a line break after like the first couple words, or was that an automatic wrap?
I don't think I did a line break. I'm just gonna do blah. Let's do hello. No, it's still gonna create it. Trying to recreate some of our errors because there was like one of those big red things saying error, we can't do it. But I didn't read it because I freaked out and I just pressed back and then redid it again and it was able to produce a non-error.
So did you stop your server at all during that time?
I don't think I did. My server's been running.
Can you Command F in here and look for like error or any of the keywords that you remember from the error? We might be able to debug from there.
Oh, this is it. Oh,
okay.
No, wait, this is I was working on, what is this?
Is that an older?
Well, maybe now I'm confused. This is my active record that I was working on this morning.
If you click like the little arrows, but over by the done button on the right-hand side, you should be able to like scroll through different, yeah.
We're gonna see all the active obstacle course. Okay. Still here.
Yeah. I think if you find that error.
Scrolling through the exact same thing because I'm pretty sure I didn't work on it that long.
Gotcha. Okay, well, no worries. I just thought maybe it would be just hanging out there for us to look at. But
internal service error. Would it be that one? Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, we tried to do oil car.
So let's read the error.
All right, I'm gonna make it bigger for y'all.
Record not unique.
Unique violation. Duplicate key value violates unique constraint.
That was our first oil car though.
Key ID 5 already exists. So it seems like maybe we got into a weird sync with Postico and your DB where you're trying to add a record with the same ID as one that already exists. I think that's what the only problem was.
Okay.
Yeah, so you could like, I don't know if y'all were manually setting an ID or if it's just a weird thing where it was out of sync, but you could probably like delete a single record if it's causing you trouble and start over. Yeah, the only issue seems to be that it was attempting to create a record with the same primary key as a record that already existed.
Yeah, I think it corrected itself because once I hit back and once I hit submit again, it was able to jump from 5 to 6.
Magic.
So maybe Postico and Rails are smart enough to do that potentially.
Was it thrown off because you had a null? Did the null line throw off the ID number?
The null one, it was 8. 8 was the null one.
It was after. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, this looks like good exploration. I'm gonna let y'all keep poking around at stuff. I just wanted to check in, but
thank you. Yeah, we were just playing around.
Looks good. All right, thanks y'all.
It's gonna tell me
Git is not initialized or whatever. Well, probably not.
Oh, if it does, that would be an issue. I think we're good. So we should have fixed that with the Xcode select install that we did yesterday.
Hey y'all, I hate to interrupt good debugging, but I'm going to close out the breakout rooms just as a heads up.
Perfect. Do a here. Let's do this. Let's Dougie, I'll shoot you a DM and let's go to a different room so we can figure this out.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Could I get a hand raise reaction if you were able to complete up to the extensions? Wonderful. Great. Okay, I think that's pretty good. Let's go ahead and take a palm and come back at 10:38, and then we'll talk about some of the stuff that we were looking at in post-to-code. Hello, folks. As you're coming back, just be thinking about the discussions that you had in your breakout rooms about the questions in the post-co activity, because I'd like to hear from a few people about it. I'll give people a couple more seconds to get back and turn on cameras if they so choose. Let's see. Cool. I'd like to hear, let's see. Can I hear from somebody in room 2? So that would be Claudia or Ksenia or Olivia. How many databases do you see in Postico for Task Manager?
I think we see 3 or yeah.
3? Okay. What were the like names of those? What was
Sorry, I missed your question. Did you mean the tables? Because I see AR, internal metadata, schema migrations, and tasks.
No, I didn't mean tables. I meant databases. So yeah, that makes sense. Do you mind sharing your screen real quick and we'll just look at it together if you have it handy?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
So task manager development.
Yeah.
And tasks.
So if you go back one step, that's good. So we have task manager development. How many, do we have other databases for task manager? I guess is a better way for me to ask my question.
Yeah, we have 2. We have the task manager development and the task manager test.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, and I'm going to push that question a little bit more. Do you have an idea as to why?
We kind of got stuck on this question. I was thinking that the development is for like what's eventually going to be put on a real website, and the test is for like testing sandbox kind of things.
Yeah, that's a great answer and a great like kind of guess, right? And to expand on that a little bit more, I like what you said about how like what you're working with in development is eventually going to go onto like a real website. We will eventually expand to talking about development databases, test databases, and production databases. And production is kind of, I think, what you're talking about, Claudia, like eventually what we're building in development will go live on a real website on a production database, which is, you can think of it as like the real thing. Like development is rehearsal, and then production is like the production of a play, is an analogy I like. So, but then taking production out of the mix, knowing that development is where we probably are doing our work and poking around at things. And I'll open this up to anybody who wants to raise their hand. Yeah, what is the purpose of Task Manager Test? Why do we have a separate database for test? And it's okay if these are just like ideas or shots in the dark. Alexander?
To protect the data. I think we read like an article about how GitHub, they didn't have the 2 set up right, and they ended up kind of destroying a bunch of their data.
Yeah, that's a good point, that's different data between the 2 pieces. I wouldn't necessarily say that we have this to protect the data, but rather to have an entirely different set to use. So thank you, Alexander. And like to kind of like clarify on that further, we haven't written any tests yet, but eventually we will. And we want different records in our tests than we have in development. They are 2 totally separate working environments. They're separate databases. And the tests are responsible for setting up the data and tearing it down, setting it up when they start to run and then tearing it down before they stop running or after they run. So that way, the data that you're using in development doesn't interfere with any of the functionality of your tests to give false positives or cause issues or anything like that. So we'll talk about this in more detail, but I wanted to make sure that we talked about that distinction. There's the Task Manager Development Database and there's a Task Manager Test Database, and we can think of them, we could really think of both of them as sandboxes, but one of them is for dedicated automated tests only using RSpec, which we'll get into later in the week. Cool. Thanks for sharing, Claudia. You can take back your screen now if you'd like. Cool. Let me see. What else do we have here? I'd like to hear from somebody who I haven't heard from in class yet today. This question, how would you describe your task manager development database schema? I'll take a volunteer. Ksenia.
I'm probably wrong, but I'll try. So that would be ID as a primary key integer, title as a string, and description as a string.
Yeah, that's great. So thank you. And that's what I would expect to hear, you know, and I think if you wanted to provide more detail, you could use some of the terminology we've been exploring today and learning about today. You could say, I have a tasks table with a primary key of ID, and my columns are such and such, and then you can go forward with how you describe like the different data types. That was good. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, let me just check my notes here real quick and see what we've got next. Yeah, so before we move on and start talking about ORMs and Activerecord, I wanted to open up and see if any questions came out of that activity. What questions are coming up for y'all? Joe?
Yeah, so when we were working on the project and like when I was doing an IC and the pre-work, I was like creating and adding to tables from the terminal instead of using Postico. Is there a preference on which avenue to take, or is it just situational?
Yeah, good question. What I'll say is eventually, like, we've talked about how we're going to be using SQL to make changes to our database and all that good stuff. And we're going to get more into how that works with a Rails project with migrations and stuff like that. And I'd say that's probably where I'd anticipate spending most of your time as you're working with your database schema and adding records and stuff like that. We're going to be working a lot with Activerecord and Rails and generators. But as far as the like a preference between Postico and like, I'm guessing you were using, sorry, let me clarify. Are you talking about like using PSQL and going into the terminal and doing stuff there versus using Postico?
Well, so I did the generate migration to kind of create the table, migrated it over, and then did Rails C for Rails console. Yeah, I did it that way. I mean, Postico definitely has the advantage of like the visually being like easier as compared to like kind of doing it in your head at first, you know, before you create the table and everything on the terminal. But other than that, like visual advantage, I was just curious if, you know, if one was preferred over the other, but you pretty much answered it in terms of like going forward in the future. I know there's more powerful tools like Generate and Scaffold to create things like way further down the road. But just in terms of like right now where we're doing everything kind of more granularly to like better understand what's going on under the hood when we do generate stuff, like is Postico basically the way to go?
Gotcha. Thanks for expanding on that and clarifying. Yeah, so what I'll say is, yeah, to your point, we are going to be using like the generators are okay to use for creating tables and using Activerecord and Rails C and all these other tools that we have for manipulating the database and the schema and stuff. The main goal of using Postico today, or I'd say really at all, would be more as like a visualization tool and to get a representation to look at of what your tables are doing that is just a little bit more visually pleasing, like you were saying, Joe. Typically, I would not expect if we were working on like a big production level project to go into Postico or any tool like that and be moving things around or changing things. It's a little bit dangerous and that's probably not a skill that's going to be directly applicable. Like But Postico is a good tool for just the visualization, and that's why we're using it today, just to kind of conceptualize how databases work. Not to say there aren't other uses for Postico, but we'll be focusing a lot more on the active record side and on migrations and all that in the future. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. I really appreciate the explanation.
Of course. What other questions are coming up? Ryan?
Yeah, just another like big picture, trying to wrap my head around this. Postgres is like a server on our computer, because in order, or is it? You kind of shook your head there, though. I'm confused on like in order to have an app, you have to have a server to send an HTTP request to. And normally servers don't exist on your computer. So right now we're like kind of like faking it out. Is that kind of what's going on? Okay. Yeah. I thank you for bringing this up. Sorry for like the head shake. Didn't mean to startle you. Yeah, your question is a good one to chat through. The database and the server are completely separate. So kind of thinking back to what Brian was saying yesterday, when we're thinking of the server as far as our local development, we would think of going to our browser and that's our client. And then the server is what's running in the terminal. It's our Rails app, right? As far as not expecting a server to like be on your computer, but to be out, like you go connect to a server somewhere. Later in the mod, we'll have an opportunity to talk about deploying to like the cloud. So a server elsewhere, not just on our computer, not just a loopback. But really for today, what I think is important to understand is that you have your Rails server here, and you have all this other HTTP stuff, the internet, the world out on this side. And then your Rails server will connect to your database, which is a separate entity. And Activerecord is the tool that lets Rails communicate with the database using SQL by using Activerecord as an adapter. And we're going to get into that next in the class. But yeah, good to bring up that servers and databases are two separate things. Does that answer your question, Ryan?
I might be able to offer a little extra
please do.
context here. I think for the purposes of like week 1 or day 2 of mod 2, when we say server and what Jameson is talking about, we're very much talking about our Rails server and our running application. But it is correct to say that your database is acting as a server. In a very general sense, a server is just something that can receive a request and send a response. It's not an HTTP server, but your database is acting as a server. That's a little bit of a nuance, and that's not, that technically would be correct to say.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification, Brian. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that's true. Cool. Other questions before we move on? Cool. Okay, I think we have some time to get started on talking about ORMs before we take another pause. Let me share my screen. Can everybody see my slides okay? Cool. Okay, so moving on to an ORM. What is an ORM? It's an object relational mapper is what that stands for. And this transforms raw data in the database into objects that we can use in our object-oriented programming language. So in our case, Ruby. It's going to take this information that we have in the database, this raw SQL, and change it into something that is just easier to work with, like Ruby objects that we've worked with before. So why use one? It's easier. Like I mentioned, it's a lot easier to work with a Ruby object, like as an instance of a class, than it is to type out a whole bunch of SQL and try to figure out the line breaks and read through the SQL language syntax. I saw a bunch of people, doing queries in Postico, and just trying out what the different syntax does, and it's just not quite as human friendly, I guess I would say, as Ruby. So a really big advantage of using an ORM is that it gives us a nice syntax, and it's just less cognitive resources to worry about there. So without an ORM, we would have to write the raw SQL, and yeah, just very complicated. Another reason is that ORMs are database agnostic. So let's say that we were working on Task Manager and we were using Postgres, and then eventually we decided we don't really want to use Postgres anymore. We want to change this over to SQLite or something like that. Well, with an ORM, the ORM isn't going to care which database management system we use. It's going to understand what's going on regardless. So our code wouldn't have to change for interacting with the objects in our database, even if we switched our database, which is really, really nice. There may be like little syntactical differences here and there between the different databases, but this ORM acts as an adapter for whichever database we decide to plug into our project. Another reason to use an ORM is security, and we won't dive deeply into this during Mod 2, but it's good to be aware of some of the stuff that an ORM gives you for free, basically. It'll protect against common attacks like SQL injections. So if you were writing everything in raw SQL, you'd be more susceptible to those kinds of attacks, where an ORM provides an extra layer of security there. So yeah, those are just some overall reasons. The top three, I would say, is just it's easier. It gives us nicer syntax. It's database agnostic, so it doesn't matter which relational database we're using. The ORM will be able to understand any of them, and then also it's just that extra security. So what is Activerecord? I know we keep mentioning it and talking about it, but we haven't actually done a deep dive. So Activerecord is a Ruby ORM. It is our object relational mapper for our database when we're working with Ruby. It translates this raw data into Ruby objects, like I was mentioning. And in Rails, we create Activerecord models. So this gives us, Activerecord is a library for Ruby. So it gives us a bunch of tools to work with these objects in ways that are just easier and better for the framework at large. And these Activerecord models correspond to the tables in your database. So when we're thinking about yesterday's lesson on MVC and where models fit into the picture, models are informed by the data that we store in the database. Activerecord models are Ruby objects, so they're a lot easier to work with than working with raw SQL. So in order for models to be Activerecord models, they must inherit from Activerecord base, and that would look something like this. So I'll leave this up here for a second just for people to get a good chance to look at it. Excuse me. You can see this is like a two-step inheritance, where we have our task model. This class task inherits from application record, and then application record is another class that will inherit from Activerecord base. So eventually our task model or our task class is inheriting from Activerecord base, and that gives us access to everything that a model can do. It gives us access to Activerecord model methods, etc. Cool. Yeah, okay. So we'll talk a little bit about Rails console. It's another thing that Rails gives us that is really, really useful when it comes to working with Activerecord and Activerecord models. It's really useful for debugging. You can run Rails console or Rails C from the command line. It's very similar to running Rails server or Rails S. In Rails, a lot of our commands can be conveniently abbreviated. So if you run Rails console from the command line, it'll open up a REPL similar to pry. So we've all used pry, and we've all talked about and used REPLs. Pry gives you access to everything in that environment. And when we are running Rails C from the console, we're getting access to our development environment. And technically what this is doing is opening an interactive Ruby or IRB session. I'm not sure how familiar people are with IRB. I think we try to focus on Pry at Turing more, but it's very similar functionality to what you have when you use Pry. So the thing to keep in mind is that when you open an IRB session and when you open Rails console, this is going to load up your whole application, including your models. So you would be able to run Activerecord commands to CRUD resources from there. And it's just useful for interacting with your models in general. So seeing if a model exists or yeah, just kind of experimenting with things in a sandbox. So we're going to have an opportunity pretty much for the rest of class with, we'll tie it up at the end with some questions and recap. But we have this chance to work in the Rails console and try out some Activerecord. So I'll be sending you into your breakout rooms, and same as before, if everybody could work on the task individually and just discuss questions or anything that comes up as a group. Just as long as everybody gets a chance to practice this. Then once you finish, work on the checks for understanding. If you have a lot of extra time, you all can, like if you have time left over, you all can work on the checks for understanding and talk through them together. But if you don't have time, you can, that's something I would highly recommend coming back to is the CFUs. So just to reiterate, we are going to start here in the lesson plan, Rails console activity. And go all the way through the checks for understanding. We'll take, I think, about 30 minutes for this Rails console activity, and then we'll take a POM and we'll come back for questions at 11:30. But if you do have extra time, go ahead and move on with your group to the checks for understanding. Any questions about this activity before I send you into breakout rooms? Okay, I will close these rooms in about 30 minutes, but feel free to give us a shout at any point if you have any questions.
I think we got Dougie's issue taken care of.
That's great. I'm sorry if I cut y'all off, but did that work okay to run off to a different room and figure it out?
Yeah, he was like waiting for some command to finish running, and as soon as it finished running, we checked it and it was good to go. So it was great timing.
I'm really glad. Hi, Dougie.
Super quick question.
Sure.
Should I have been able to see tasks, or am I supposed to create those, or in Postico? I mean,
Postico.
I know.
No,
I wasn't.
Okay, the answer is no, because we just set up your app. So you have yet. So we created the database, but you would actually have to like go use the app to add tasks to your database. So what you can do is you can work through this activity. In this activity, you should learn how can you add tasks to your database without using the app per se.
Well, that's my question. The very second step says view all tasks, but there are no tasks for me to view. Am I understanding that incorrectly, or?
So I would say you've viewed them. If you see that there's no tasks, then you don't have any tasks.
Oh, okay. But it says add some new rows to your task table. I don't have a task table. Maybe I'm not sure if I'm.
Sorry, you need to run Rails DB migrate from the command line.
Oh.
Sorry about that. I forgot about that step.
Might have missed that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just you haven't worked through the tutorial. You downloaded the app, but like there's still just a couple of things we have to set up for it.
Okay.
So after you run that command, you should be able to see the task table, but it should be empty.
Try refreshing. Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. I appreciate it. I'm gonna run back to the. I'm super sorry about this.
No, you're good. You're good. Forgot about that one very important step.
It's like he got to a good place. Sorry, I wasn't sure of the context of what he was running into right away, but that makes sense.
Yeah, I figured you wouldn't have that context.
It's good though. I'm glad y'all got the environment issues sorted out.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. Because we don't have any of the like theme inning stuff, is it okay if I move gear up on Friday to 1?
Sure, that works for me.
And we do have a, if we leave it as an hour and 15, we have a 45-minute gap before cohort retro.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think if there's anything we should put there.
Mm.
I'll think about it.
Yeah, nothing specific comes to mind, but I guess we could just say work time if we don't have anything, right?
Yeah. I'll leave it there, and if we come up with something, we can put it there, but it's only 45-minute gap, so
yeah,
kind of tough to do anything with that.
Yeah, makes sense. Sounds good to me. Hey, everybody. Hopefully that was a good activity and you learned a lot or got to experiment with some new stuff. I think we should probably take a quick pause before we wrap up. So let's come back at 11:31. All right. Hi, everybody. Actually, before we go into that slide, I was going to ask what questions came up for y'all during that Rails console activity. Joe?
Yeah, sorry. So in terms of like the functionality for new versus create, like what's the point? Like before you save a new, right? Like before it gets saved to the table, is there an advantage to like, I guess it just kind of like sits in limbo. Is there a way to like manipulate those records before they get saved to the table? You know what I mean? In terms of functionality, I don't understand like what the point is.
Sure.
Why not just do create?
Sure. Yeah, and part of your question was you asked if is there a way to manipulate those objects if all you've used is new and you haven't saved, you haven't used create. And I'll answer at least that part of your question with another question. Where do we get access to the method .new? What?
From Activerecord?
Not quite.
I'm not sure then.
No worries. Yeah. Anybody else like have a guess? Anybody know about .new, Joey?
Well, my gut went to it's Ruby. We've created like an instance of an object. We just haven't passed that instance of an object to the table. So it should be in Ruby.
Yep, exactly. It's a Ruby method. When we're saying something .new, that's very similar or the same. You can think of it as like the other Ruby objects that you've worked with in the past, where you create an object and you can save that to a variable. And this behaves a lot in the same way. Then save and create are unique to Activerecord. So I would say, it's possible Brian will have something to add on to this, but I often think about like the new and save pattern as having the advantage of you can create this new object and maybe do some custom code that validates certain things about the object before saving it to the database. You might want to handle like a successful save versus a non-successful save differently. And in certain cases, it might be more readable and clear to create a new object and then save and then handle the save versus doing it all in one step, because create is doing the new and save combined. Yeah, that's what I would say to that. It just depends upon the case, but it's I would note that new is not new, which is funny to say, but new is not new with Activerecord. And yeah, an advantage would be you could create a new object and then handle some logic and or handle different cases based on whether the save was successful.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Sure. Aiden.
Kind of piggybacking off of what Joe was asking, what is your like go-to? Would you use create or add?
Or would I use create or?
Create, or what was the other one? Sorry.
Oh, the new and save?
Yeah, new and save or create, sorry.
Let's see.
Do you have one that you use like 90% of the time and the other is more situational, or is it very like just situational all the time?
I would describe it as pretty situational. I think my instinct or my habit is to go for create. That being said, we'll get more into like in a different lesson error handling and what we do if like a create wasn't successful and different ways to handle that. I think some of it comes down to personal preference. I don't have a strong personal preference, but usually I think of create if I'm just jumping into Rails console and I'm trying to see if I can create a few records, or I'm putting in a few records to go look at my development environment on localhost. I'd probably just reach for create, but there are some advantages to using new and then save. I think it depends.
Okay.
Sorry for the non-answer.
That's okay. And I had one more question, if that's okay.
Of course.
When we run like .all or .find, part of the array that it's creating is this limit with a number. What is that?
Do you have it handy? And we could, if you could share your screen, we could look at it together. I'm not sure off the top of my head what that is.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it happened here as well with dealing with find.
Yeah, I think that this is a nuance of, and I'm open to being corrected because I'm not 100% sure why we get this. Well, with the find, it's a little bit more clear because when we're using the find method, we're asking for one record back. We're reading, you could think of it in CRUD, we're reading that one record. When you're using find, if you're saying task.all rather, I'm sorry, if you're saying task.all and it's telling you, I think it was limit 11, I'm pretty sure that's like a nuance and magic of Activerecord saying, oh, I already know how many records I'm retrieving from the database. And then it translates that to SQL and SQL says limit 11, there are 11 here. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if that's why or how it does it. I'm not sure under the hood, but yeah, the limit I wouldn't worry about too much as long as it looks accurate for what you're trying to do. When you see the SQL that's run after you execute your query, if it says limit 1 and you're trying to find one record, yeah, that's just the SQL doing what you wanted in its own very SQL way. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Sure. I have a few other talking points we can go through, but does anybody else have questions that came up? Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, we were kind of playing around with it. For example, we used the test.new. We just called a variable blue equals test.new, and then we destroyed it. Well, we saved it, then we destroyed it, but then you can still call it. So we noticed that it's still, if you type blue, it'll still show what it was, even though it's not there anymore. But then if you open a new session, then I mean it's not there, but I just thought it was kind of weird that the memory of it or some sort of remnant is still there.
Interesting. Do you mind sharing your screen and maybe we could walk through that together so that.
Oh, yeah, actually it was my partner Brisa who did that.
Yeah, that was me. We can try creating it together.
Okay,
Let me
let's see what we can do.
All right, my screen's a little bit messy. So I'm just going to do the create one because it's easier. We have laundry right there. We do orange dot. Is it delete or destroy?
Destroy.
Yeah. And then we can call the variable orange one more time, and you can still see it here, but you can no longer see it here.
Yep.
But when we open up a brand new session on the console, you can't call orange anymore.
Yeah, that's interesting. All I really have to say is like it seemed like you have that local variable orange and this probably like just hasn't been garbage collected. Like it's just holding on to the object that was there. But yeah, Brian, do you have anything to add there? Why I think that's expected behavior, but I can't quite put to words why. I think Brian's still here, maybe?
Yeah,
Okay,
I would say that this is really hitting on a key point, which I think Jameson will talk about, that your Ruby program and your database are separate. So just because that Ruby object exists in that IRB session, Brisa, you showed us that it doesn't exist in the database when we look at post-it-go. So that's just a very key point that these are two separate things that they just talk to each other. So essentially Brisa said, hey, I want the database to go destroy this thing, and it destroyed it, but only in the database, not in your running Ruby console session.
Yeah, because then once we open up that brand new console session, you can't call it anymore. So it's
Yeah,
kind
so
of
it
like
only exists in there.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. Yeah. And the way that I think of that, let me see, putting it to words. Okay. Yeah, you have we talked about being in your REPL and having IRB open and behaving like a pry. You have, there's that distinction that Brian is talking about between, your Ruby program memory and then the persistent data that we talked about earlier, actually getting data to persist in your database and then being able to retrieve that from your database for your Ruby program. So yeah, just difference in how the memory works, I think, is what y'all are running into there. Cool. Let's see. I'll take a couple volunteers just for some quick questions from the checks for understanding. I don't think we'll go through all of them. Let's see. I'll take a volunteer. How would we, and I'll have you share your screen and walk through it. How would you change an attribute of an existing record in the database? If you want to take a stab at that and screen share, just raise your hand. That'd be great. And if you don't know how to do it, that's okay too. If you want to volunteer, we'll figure it out together. Con, I see you had an idea in the chat. I think you were voluntold. Would you share your screen?
Sure. Great.
Great. So here we are in the terminal. Yeah, you have an idea of how we would update a record, like you typed in the chat here. How would we update a record from the terminal?
If I would say, looking at what we just did, it would be a task.update. And then inside these parentheses, let's say for description, I would select that and then say, and then I would press enter. Oh.
Interesting. Can't modify frozen hash. What is task if you just type in lowercase task? I know, I don't remember this error exactly. I can't modify frozen hash. Is this something that you've destroyed? Like, have you gotten rid of the, like, what happens if we exit out and come back into Rails console, I guess is, let's see if we have a task. Probably won't, because every time we exit out, we have to start it up again. So let's just kind of go from the beginning. So if you create one, yeah, okay, so we want to probably find one of those first. Now I'm asking you to do multiple queries for this one, but this is good practice. So let's find one and set it to a variable.
5.
Okay.
Okay, so I can just any kind of variable here?
Sure, if you want to do it the way that we were doing it before, or like the syntax you had before, you could set that to lowercase task as a variable. You could say task equals, and then you can either type out again task.find parentheses 5.
Yeah.
But you can go ahead and run that if you'd like.
Okay.
A cool kind of shortcut that I'll mention in case people haven't seen it is you can use underscore. I don't know if y'all have used that before, but underscore will return the last return value in this session. So you could do task equals underscore. Not super important, but not super important, but kind of handy.
Cool.
So if you run
I'm gonna
that,
try this.
Yeah. Cool.
Yay.
So then if you type out task, you should get that exact record back. Cool.
Sweet. So would I be able to now do an update?
Let's try it.
Okay.
Oh,
hey.
It does look like we missed a quotation mark. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're inside your quotes. Can you try just like putting another double quote and clicking enter? Okay, now let's try it all over again. Yeah.
Should I?
No.
Oh, okay, cool.
The command, sorry, I think we just got stuck inside that opening quote. Yeah.
Moldy clothes.
There we go.
Looks good, right?
Looks good to me.
Okay.
Let's try it. Now what is task? Uh-oh. What did we do wrong here? Oh no, I see a difference in our prompt. Hold on, let me look at this for a second. I'm sorry.
I think you needed to put another end parentheses.
You're so
Because you
right.
put the next.
Yep, we need another end paren. Let's see. So if you, yeah, go ahead, Con, and push enter there. Okay, so
All
there.
right,
Sorry about that.
No,
Yeah,
that was my fault.
go ahead.
And then am I now doing the update?
Yeah, now you should be able to pass in, I think.
Yay.
There we go. And this was all a great lesson in, that I failed in reading the like output that you're getting back and making sure you're like with that first error where we missed the quotation mark. But yeah, now that we got that feedback, syntax error, expected end of input, and we were able to get our task back. Yeah, now that update works. Thank you for demonstrating all that, Con. Looks really good.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool, cool.
I'm really glad I did that actually. So thank you.
It's good to work through these things for sure. Let's see, what else do we have in these CFUs? Cool. Alexander, did you have a question or anything to add?
Yeah. So when we missed that quotation mark, it went on the next line. It's like 007:1 instead of 0.
Mm-hmm.
And then like, I guess when we fixed it, it went back to being a 0 instead of a 1. What's the significance of that 1?
You're talking about here, I think I can annotate as well. You're talking about these numbers that are changing after our like typo, right? Like
right. Yeah. Yeah. Con just highlighted it.
Yeah. So I'm not exactly like, I'll be completely honest. I don't know the exact logic of how these numbers like increment, but I should have slowed down and looked at them to see that we were like incrementing here and that IRB was giving us some kind of feedback, you know? That's to say, I don't know exactly what these numbers after IRB main colon represent, but yeah, good to keep an eye on, because if you notice, where was it? Yeah, I honestly don't have a very good answer for what those numbers represent. I'm sorry. Maybe Brian knows. That's not something.
I don't know what the numbers represent, but the way that I interpret it is that it was essentially treating all of that as one line.
Yeah,
that's what I was thinking. So it's like if you have a multi-line like loop or something, and you haven't like put the end in yet or something along those lines. Okay,
I think that's right.
Yeah, thanks. I like that way of understanding it. Cool. Okay, let's see. I do want to wrap up here pretty quickly. If there are more questions about this, we can continue discussing in the code help channel and stuff like that. But let's go ahead and run through a couple of slides as you know, our key takeaways and a recap. 1 second here. So the main things to take away from today are these points from our ORM segment especially. Active record objects are a representation of what's stored in the database, and it's technically possible for that to get out of sync, but generally the active record objects that you are working with are a direct representation of the data that is being stored in your database, and active record objects are just an easier way to work with that. Active Record has many built-in methods for querying the database. We just practiced with update. There are others in the checks for understanding that I'd recommend exploring if you haven't already and practicing with. These built-in methods for querying the database are crucial for our CRUD functionality in the project. So the Active Record method will also correspond with the action that you're trying to accomplish, the CRUD action. So to create a record, it'll be active record it'll be the active record model dot create, and then you pass it the attributes. Same for destroy, and we've like kind of touched on some of those. So these are built-in methods to really become comfortable and familiar with. And then the other is that all active record commands execute SQL under the hood to communicate with the database. And that you can think of active record as an adapter or a dongle or a translator or something like that to go between your Ruby code and the database. So putting that into an illustration over here, we have your database, and on the other side, we have the Ruby program. One speaks Ruby, one speaks SQL, and the way that we are going to translate between them is with active record. So sending something over to active record from Ruby, saying something like, oh, please go get me all the tasks. And you write this, and you write this by calling an active record method, which active record says, yes, I know how to do that. We call the active record methods, and it goes over to the database, and it will translate what you have asked for with the active record method into SQL, so it can ask the database for that data in SQL. So active record will translate the method that we call to a SQL query. The database will say, yes, here's some raw data. This is SQL. Active record, you understand this. So active record says, yes, I understand this. I will change this into Ruby objects and return it to the Ruby program. So now we have, using our example, an array of Ruby objects that represent the tasks that exist in our database. I'll mention just a couple of other small things here before we wrap up. I think it's probably worth mentioning that active record is not synonymous with Rails. You can use it in other frameworks such as Sinatra. So active record is a gem. It does come for free with Rails, and Rails is pretty much always going to use active record. But you could use active record elsewhere, like in a Sinatra project if you wanted to. Let's see. No, I think that was all I had. I could probably take like 1 or 2 more questions before we go through a couple housekeepings and wrap up. All right. Well, cool. In that case, thank you for hanging in for this, hanging in there for this 3-hour lesson this morning. This is, a lot of really high-level material, lots of new terminology, but we'll have lots of opportunities to practice it. Yeah, so I think that is all I have for you all today. A couple of quick things before we hit 12 o'clock. Housekeeping-wise, I would really appreciate it if you all could go into the calendar event and fill out the survey for this class. We really appreciate that feedback, and it helps us, just teach a little bit better, hopefully, and include the material that's most relevant. So yeah, we appreciate that feedback. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention was, yeah, I know that today is a really hard day, and I'm sorry for not mentioning this at the beginning of class, but I'll mention it now before lunch, given the violence in Boulder yesterday. And I want to make space for whatever people are feeling or going through with that, especially those of us who are like in Colorado or near Boulder. So I wanted to mention, in case people didn't get a chance to see it, that June posted in the announcements channel that he's going to be running a lunch group in support for anybody who's kind of going through it with this tragedy in Boulder yesterday. So yeah, I wanted to just say, like, I understand that it's probably very stressful and emotional for several people, and we want to be supportive of everybody through that. Yeah, and just give you space to deal with this stuff in the way that's best for you. And I especially wanted to highlight June's lunch group, because that's a really good resource to take advantage of if you need to and can. So yeah, thank you again, everybody. Please remember the survey, and that's all I have. So I'll let you all get to lunch a few minutes early. And if you want to stick around and ask questions in the next 5 minutes, that's fine too. Thanks, y'all. Yes, what's up, Brian?
Maybe just like one last like mental walkthrough on the PostgreSQL. Like, I guess as simple as the question is like what it is. I get that it's like a database, but I guess for some reason I'm having a hard time understanding the idea that like a database is like a collection of tables. And if I make a database, it can be like anywhere on my computer, right? Like, and then how does that relate to like Postico and PostgreSQL and SQL itself? I just feel like it's gotten so far separated. Like Ruby is Ruby, and Ruby has like Ruby docs. And if I want to know how to use Ruby, I can go to the Ruby docs and look up like how to use it. But like if I want to use SQL, it seems like there's all these programs that are like piggybacking on SQL. And it's like, okay, if you want to create a database, store it. I just get lost all of a sudden. I don't know why.
Yeah, no, it's complicated and multifaceted, and that totally makes sense. It's a good question. So here's just the way that I think of it. And yeah, maybe you'll have follow-up questions or Brian will add on. But you mentioned like there's Ruby, and Ruby has docs, and we go to the docs to learn about Ruby. So let's see, where do I want to start? So where I'll start is with SQL, I suppose. So SQL is a language. It's a really old language. It's been used for databases for years and years and years. So I think maybe possibly as a result of that, a lot of management systems have kind of sprung up to support people working with SQL. And that's kind of goes back to what we talked about with it being, with Postgres really being a database management system. It allows like an environment to interact with SQL and to create those tables, and it'll have its own syntaxes and conventions, and something like SQLite will also work with the language SQL, but it might have small differences in syntax for certain queries and stuff like that. So when we say it can be, I think where I have a tendency to like get confused, and why I think it's confusing is we tend to say, oh, what are you using as your database? Postgres. That's technically not the perfect terminology, but that's kind of how people understand and talk about it. I'm using Postgres as my database. And pretty much anytime you're using SQL, well, as far as I know, anytime you're using SQL, it's going to be a relational database. Let's see. And then to your question about Postico, Postico is just like a visualization tool. So Postico basically takes what's happening in Postgres, which you can interact with Postgres in your terminal if you want, and write SQL, just raw SQL in your terminal using Postgres. But Postico is a way to take what exists in your Postgres database and display it in a graphic interface. So it's just more pleasant to the eye. And that's the distinction I would make. SQL is the language. Postgres is the platform, for lack of a better word. Like it's where we're writing our SQL. And then Postico is just a tool to kind of get a bird's eye view of what's happening in Postgres. Another way that I would another complexity that we're going to be adding on is you talk about, we have Ruby and then we go to the Ruby docs to figure out Ruby stuff. Well, now we're entering the world of Rails, and Ruby on Rails also has a set of documentation, and there are things that are unique to Rails that you don't have in plain Ruby. So I think it totally depends upon like the situation, but there have been situations where I've run into issues with my database, and I have gone down rabbit holes looking for the right like SQL query or something like that, and then I realize, oh, I have to read my error really closely because this is a problem with Postgres. Like I have to go check a Postgres versioning issue or something like that. So is that helpful? Does that give a little bit more context?
Yeah. And the last thing I'll ask is, so when we created like the task manager, we hit like DB create. And then like, if I open Postico, it seems like I can easily just find that task manager development, task manager test. Is there like, does it exist as like a file extension somewhere? Just like my index is index.html.erb. Is there like task development.sql somewhere that exists? Or
that's a good question. So when you run Rails DB create or any of the commands like Rails DB drop, Rails DB migrate, which we'll be using more and more as we go on through the mod, those are scripts or tasks that Rails gives us for free to interact with whatever database we have configured. So while it doesn't generate a file that you could go look at necessarily, like a view, like if you were generating a view. What it will do is change your schema. So your source of truth within the Rails project for your database is under DB. I think the folder is, I think the path is app.db, and then the file is schema.rb. And that, we haven't really gotten into it yet,
Okay.
but that's the file that will be changed using things like migrations. And it may look it may look reminiscent to the visual schema diagram that we had you draw for the project.
Okay. Thank you for taking the time. That clears things up a little bit for me.
Of
I think
course.
it'll get
Glad.
clearer as time goes. Like right now, it's just the compounding is like draining me a little.
Yeah, totally understandable. But I agree. I think that these things will start to click a little bit more as you have more of a chance to use them.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Have a good one. All right. Thank you for sticking around a little late, Brian.
Absolutely. Are you still recording?
I am. Let me stop that.